Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. There is 4 months left in 2023, and over the next 4 months, the UFC is giving out a bunch of undeserved UFC title shots. And I wanted to make a video discussing this because the UFC is heading down a slippery slope to becoming the WWE and essentially handing out title shots based on popularity. And this is something that will delegitimize the sport. And this is something that has always gone on, but it's trending upwards and it's becoming more and more commonplace. And the MMA media is an absolute disaster, and they are really unwilling to call it out or criticize it in the capacity it needs to be criticized because they want this to happen. They are cheerleading these efforts for a multitude of reasons, which we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the video. But there are 4 undeserving title shots coming up for the rest of 2023. Now, 2 of them are officially confirmed, and the other 2 I'm going to discuss are not confirmed but are highly probable. We're going to discuss those in this video as well, and we're also going to discuss the title fights that should actually be happening based on a meritocracy. And I understand the UFC is a business. I understand the UFC isn't always a meritocracy. There is some gray areas. But when you're blatantly giving out title shots based on star power, you're blatantly letting champions decide who they're going to defend their titles against, essentially you delegitimize the sport. And I've touched on all these fights in previous videos, but I wanted to make a dedicated video discussing it because the more and more we accept it, the more and more commonplace it's going to be. And the MMA media isn't willing to criticize it. And even you have like other MMA media personalities, whether it be YouTubers or people who cover the sport on Twitter. I know that those people exist. They're not willing to criticize it either, at least to a certain extent, because it indirectly puts money in their pockets. So I wanted to call it out in this video. Let's start off with the first undeserving title shot. This goes down at UFC 293 on September 9th. And this is probably the most forgiving title shot on the entire list. And that is Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland for the UFC middleweight title. This fight really shouldn't be happening, and poor choices led to this title fight. Sean Strickland is on a 2-fight winning streak. Just last December, he lost a decision to Jared Cannonier. And I understand that was a very close fight, and I understand you could have easily given it to Sean Strickland. So that's why this fight's a little bit more forgivable, because if for not that loss against Jared Cannonier, he'd be on a longer winning streak. But his last win was against Abus Magomedov, who's unranked. A good opponent, but unranked. His last fight before that was short notice against Nasruddin Imavov, who I believe was ranked somewhere between 13 and 15 at the time. And while Sean Strickland's a very good fighter, he's ranked in the top 10 of the division, he's on a 2-fight winning streak, it really shouldn't have been this fight. And a series of poor decision-making by the UFC is what led to this fight. Because in reality, at UFC 293, we should be getting Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis. And the UFC, for whatever reason, they just made bad decisions, and this fight is not happening now because of the UFC's poor decision-making. And instead, we're getting a very less fun and less compelling title fight in Adesanya versus Strickland, because Dricus du Plessis is undefeated in the UFC. He's on a 6-fight winning streak in the UFC, and he's coming off a brutal destruction of Robert Whittaker. How has that not earned him a title shot? I understand he has a foot injury, but the UFC booked it at UFC 290. They booked Dricus du Plessis to take on Robert Whittaker at UFC 290 in early July. They knew back in May that at UFC 293, it was going to be in Australia, it was going to be in early September, and they wanted to headline with Israel Adesanya. And even before the UFC booked Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis, Adesanya said, no, don't make that fight. Let me take on Dricus du Plessis in my next title fight. That's the fight that I want. And the UFC said, no, we're going to make this. This is going to be a #1 contender fight. Why wouldn't they schedule it earlier? They could have scheduled it a couple weeks earlier. They could have made UFC 293 a couple weeks later, and we could have gotten the fight that we actually deserve. We could have gotten Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis, which in my opinion is a much funner fight. It's a much more fan-friendly matchup. And on top of that, it's so compelling. If Dricus du Plessis can beat Robert Whittaker and stop Robert Whittaker, who was the second best middleweight in the division up until UFC 290, all bets are off. He might be able to take out Israel Adesanya. And instead now, we get a very good Sean Strickland who really doesn't have finishing ability, who really hasn't shown the skills to be able to go out there and dethrone a guy like Israel Adesanya. And of course, he could pull it off. Anything can happen in MMA. We've seen it time and time again. No one expected Du Plessis to defeat Robert Whittaker. But at the end of the day, it should have been figured out way ahead of time. They knew this event was happening back in May. They should have figured it out way ahead of time, where the winner of Whittaker versus Du Plessis could have easily had a decent amount of time to train to fight for the title against Israel Adesanya at UFC 293. It makes absolutely no sense to have the number one contender fight and then already know when the champion's defending, and those are 8 weeks apart. That's unfair to the contender. And of course, Dricus Du Plessis says he's dealing with a lingering foot injury. He can't take the fight. But imagine had they scheduled Whittaker versus Du Plessis 2 to 3 weeks earlier, and imagine had they scheduled UFC 293 2 to 3 weeks later. Then this fight could have actually happened. But at the end of the day, I don't like this fight. I don't love this fight by any means. But this isn't the biggest problem on the list. This fight is okay. At least it's a top contender. At least it's a guy on a winning streak. And at least, okay, the number one contender isn't getting skipped over. He kind of opted out due to an injury. Moving on to the next undeserved title shot, we have UFC 295 on November 11th. Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic for the UFC heavyweight title. I absolutely hate this matchmaking. I absolutely hate this fight in general. Stipe has not won a fight since August of 2020 against Daniel Cormier. That is craziness. Stipe's last fight was in March of 2021, where he got flatlined by Francis Ngannou. By the time this fight happens, you're creeping up on almost 3 years of inactivity from Stipe Miocic. And I understand a lot of people say, oh, Stipe Miocic is the greatest heavyweight of all time. Stipe Miocic had more heavyweight title defenses than anyone else. That doesn't change the fact that he sat out for almost 3 years begging for a title shot after getting flatlined by Francis Ngannou. I don't want to see this fight. Stipe Miocic is getting up there in age. He's been just answering phones at the fire department for the last 3 years. And now we're going to throw him in there with Jon Jones? We're going to throw him in there with Jon Jones, who just came off an easy win over Cyril Gane, where he captured the vacant heavyweight title. This fight makes absolutely no sense. I understand why the UFC is doing it, and essentially what they're doing is Jon Jones wants to fight Stipe Miocic because people consider Stipe Miocic the GOAT of the UFC heavyweight division, and he wants that legacy. But at the end of the day, Stipe was the GOAT of the heavyweight division years ago. He's not anymore. And I understand technically in the history books, right now, if you had to pin down a heavyweight GOAT, it'd be Stipe. But that's not the same guy anymore. It's not the same guy. He sat out for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, after getting flatlined by Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou left the organization because the UFC was unwilling to meet his contractual demands. And he went on to get the biggest contract in MMA heavyweight history. And instead, now we're getting Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic for the heavyweight title, and you have a much better contender because the UFC should have booked Jon Jones versus Sergey Pavlovich. This is a much better fight. Sergey Pavlovich is on a 6-fight winning streak, and he's won all 6 of those fights via first round TKO or KO. He is the true number one contender. He deserves this title fight. That's a much more compelling title fight than old man fire department working Stipe Miocic, who got flatlined in his last fight. But instead now, what we truly have here is I don't think the UFC is thinking, oh, Stipe's a big draw. Because a lot of people defend these title shots by saying, oh, this guy's a draw, that guy's a draw. They're not thinking that Stipe Miocic is a draw. They're just thinking Stipe Miocic is a more household name than Sergey Pavlovich. And also what you have is Jon Jones thinks this does more for my legacy than a guy like Pavlovich. This does more for me because I can say, look, I beat the consensus heavyweight GOAT in Stipe Miocic. But you really didn't, because you beat him when he was washed up. You beat him at the end of his career. You beat him after a 3-year layoff. You beat him after he got flatline KO'd by Francis Ngannou. So I hate this fight. I hate that it's headlining the MSG card. And I would much prefer Jones versus Pavlovich. And really, this fight as a whole, it's just, there's nothing to like about it. There's nothing to like about it. I'm going to, when it gets closer, I'm going to watch it. I'm going to be excited for it just because, okay, at least we don't know. Stipe could have, improved in his time off. But at the end of the day, if you can look at me with a straight face and say, yeah, I prefer John Jones versus Stipe Miocic over John Jones versus Sergey Pavlovich, you don't watch the sport, because I would be unbelievably hyped. That would be one of the biggest fights of the year to book John Jones versus Sergey Pavlovich, who's on a 6-fight winning streak, who looks unstoppable, who's finishing everyone, KOing everyone in the first round, versus Stipe Miocic, where, I mean, he looked like this in his last fight. I mean, look at this. He got flatlined by Francis Ngannou. Anybody that looked like that in their last fight should not be getting a title fight in their next fight. Stipe should have had to fight a contender. If he wins that fight, then he can get a heavyweight title shot. So I'm just disappointed in this matchup. It's an undeserved title shot for Stipe Miocic. And again, this proves another flaw with the UFC. They're not only giving guys title shots based on their star power, they're also letting guys who are champions, who have a little bit of star power, they're letting them choose who they're defending their belts against. And that's just, it's just a flaw. It's just a flaw in logic, because in a way, you're essentially putting your finger on the scale, and you have champions essentially defining their own legacy by picking out which matchups they think are most favorable. And just to rub salt in the wound, if John Jones wins this fight, I think he's retiring. I don't think we're going to see him against Pavlovich. I don't think we're going to see him against Aspinall. And if Stipe Miocic wins, he might give John Jones a rematch just for that check. But other than that, I think Stipe Miocic is going to retire. He's going to go back to answering phones at the fire department. So overall, this fight just sucks all the way around, and I'm really disappointed in this heavyweight title fight at UFC 295. Moving on to the next undeserved title shot. This one is 99% happening. It's not confirmed yet for whatever reason, but it most likely will either happen at UFC 295. It'll be the co-main event to Jones versus Stipe, or it will happen at UFC 296 on December 16th. And that is Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington for the welterweight title. This makes no sense. You can literally make a case for more than half of the division deserving a title shot over Colby Covington. Colby Covington is 2-2 in his last 4 fights, okay? He's on a 1-fight winning streak against Jorge Masvidal, who's washed up and who retired since that fight because he lost another fight. And on top of that, he has no wins on his resume against current top 15 ranked welterweights. He has no wins in his entire UFC career over current top ranked 15 welterweights, because he's been inactive, because he hasn't fought since March of 2022. He's been out for over a year and a half. And for some reason, I have my theories, the UFC is spoon feeding him a title shot. And a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people say, Colby's a draw, Colby's a draw. Colby versus Jorge Masvidal, we have, based on reliable sources, sold under 400,000 pay-per-view buys. We found out apparently Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo did roughly 250,000 to 300,000 pay-per-view buys. So Colby Covington isn't that far off from an Aljamain Sterling title defense. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. I gave you the numbers there. And people are defending it and saying Colby Covington's a draw. There is no evidence to really support that Colby Covington's a draw. But okay, the UFC thinks he's going to garner 20,000, 30,000 more pay-per-view buys, therefore putting more money in their pockets. But I don't even believe that's the real case. I believe the real case is, I think Kamaru Usman was close to pulling out of the trilogy fight back in March, UFC 286. That's why Colby Covington showed up on short notice and weighed in as a backup out of nowhere. I think Kamaru Usman was close to pulling out of the fight. I think the UFC was worried about Usman pulling out of the fight. And UFC 286, without the main event, was a disaster of a pay-per-view card. So I think the UFC is returning that favor to Colby Covington because he showed up, because he weighed in, because he was willing to fight Leon Edwards on short notice. And I think that's why the UFC is giving him a title shot, because Dana White has been adamant. This is the next welterweight title fight. But it hasn't been announced. It has not been announced. What is going on here? At this point, I've criticized the title shot. I've criticized Colby getting the title shot. But at the end of the day, just book the fight. It could have been over by now. They could have booked it for August. They could have booked it. Who knows when? They could have booked it over the last 2 months. It could have happened in July. There was rumors it was going to happen in July. But Leon Edwards doesn't want to fight Colby. Colby, for the last year and a half, has been hiding in witness protection. And I wonder what's going on in the welterweight division. But genuinely, there is so many guys that deserve a title shot more than Colby Covington, but the most deserving contender is Belal Muhammad. We should be getting Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 for the welterweight title. Belal Muhammad's on a 9-fight winning streak, and all of his last 4 wins are still ranked in the top 10. There is no doubt that that is the fight to make. I understand that Belal Muhammad isn't very liked. I understand that Belal Muhammad isn't going to kill it with pay-per-view buys. But at the end of the day, we've already established Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington isn't going to kill it with pay-per-view buys either. But maybe the UFC is desperate to fulfill that ESPN deal. They're desperate for an extra 20,000 pay-per-view buys, and maybe they're making decisions based on that. But in reality, Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad you could make. Leon Edwards versus Shavkat Rakhmonov, who, I mean, is undefeated and has finished every single one of his fights in his entire pro MMA career. You could make that fight as well, and I would not complain. It is crazy that Leon Edwards fought back in early March. It is now almost September. We still don't have a date for Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington, and Colby Covington's 2-2 in his last 4 and hasn't fought in over a year and a half. That is absolutely craziness, and it's a very undeserving title shot. It's probably the most undeserving title shot on the entire list, and that's not to say that Colby Covington isn't a good fighter. I think he could even win the title, but the point is, the fight should be based on some type of meritocracy. If I would understand, maybe Colby Covington's on a 3-fight winning streak and Belal's on a 7-fight winning streak, and maybe Colby's wins are a little bit better and you give him the title shot. But in this case, it's really comparing apples to oranges with their resumes. There is no doubt in my mind that Belal Muhammad as well as Shavkat Rakhmonov deserve a welterweight title shot more than Colby Covington. When do I think that fight's going to happen? I'll throw that into the video as well. I think it's going to happen in December. I think it's going to happen December 16th, UFC 296. That is my prediction for when Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington happens. Maybe announced soon. Moving on to the last undeserved title shot. Now, this one is very likely, but not as likely as Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. I would give this one about a 70% chance of happening, and that is Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera 2. Sean O'Malley recently at UFC 292 defeated Aljamain Sterling to win the bantamweight title, brutally TKO'd him in the second round, and he immediately calls out Marlon Vera, said Marlon Vera needs his ass beat in December because they have a history. They fought back in 2020, and Marlon Chito Vera brutally chopped his legs, shucked him to the ground, and then brutally flash KO'd him with nasty ground and pound elbows, and then O'Malley was stretchered out of the cage with no serious injuries. And after that fight, he made up a bunch of excuses and he said, this was a fluke win and I'm still undefeated. And he wants that win back. And Marlon Vera fought at UFC 292 and defeated Pedro Munoz on the same card. And so he wants that fight. He wants that win back. He wants to potentially avenge that loss he has against Vera. And this fight is so undeserving if it does happen. And he wants it for December. If this fight does happen, I believe it will happen December 16th, UFC 296. And you look at Marlon Vera, he is 1-1 in his last 2 fights. He was dominated by Corey Sandhagen, absolutely dominated. If you look at the overall resume, it says split decision loss. This should not have been a split decision loss. This was a dominant win from Corey Sandhagen. And the fact that with 1 win over Pedro Munoz, who I believe is ranked like number 10 or 11 in the bantamweight rankings, 1 win over Pedro Munoz, not even a finish, all of a sudden you're going to give him a title shot. And what's really going on here is Sean O'Malley is perceived to be the next big star in the UFC. He's already more popular than a lot of the fighters. And what the UFC wants and what Sean O'Malley wants is the most winnable matchup of any of the potential contenders in his first title defense. I'm not saying Sean O'Malley's scared of anyone, but when you look at the potential matchups, whether it be Corey Sandhagen or Merab Dvalishvili, and then you look at Marlon Vera, who I think Marlon Vera can beat him, obviously he beat him before, he's the most manageable fight. He's the most winnable fight for Sean O'Malley in his first title defense. And the UFC is going to want to cater to that because the UFC wants Sean O'Malley as a champion. So that's why I truly believe that the UFC will give O'Malley what he wants, and they will book Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera 2 for the UFC bantamweight title at UFC 296 on December 16th. And it's just unfortunate. No fighter who's 1-1 in his last 2 fights, barring some special circumstances, should be getting a title shot when you have Merab Dvalishvili, who's on a 7-fight winning streak, who absolutely dominated Petr Yan in his last fight. Oh, keep in mind, Petr Yan is the same fighter who Sean O'Malley beat to get a title shot against Aljamain Sterling. And in that fight, that was a brutal robbery. Petr Yan clearly won that fight. Sean O'Malley gets the decision because he made it competitive. He gets a title shot off a win over Petr Yan. But Merab goes out there and dominates Jan in a 5-rounder, and now he doesn't deserve a title fight, and people have already conjured up excuses. Oh, well, Merab is injured and Corey Sandhagen is injured. If that was the truth, fair enough. Okay, maybe give Marlon Vera the title shot then. But Corey Sandhagen is injured where he can't fight by December, from what I understand. Merab said he's ready to go. He said he can be ready to go in September. He can be ready to go in October. He will definitely be ready to go in December. So the UFC should book Sean O'Malley versus Merab Dvalishvili for the bantamweight title. That is the fight to make. Merab has looked unbelievable in his last few fights, and I know it's not the most aesthetically pleasing fight style, and I know it's a very tough style for someone like Sean O'Malley to deal with, but guess what? Aljamain Sterling has a similar style to Merab. Merab's a little bit different in the pressure and stamina that he has, but at the end of the day, Sean O'Malley just beat Aljamain Sterling. Very similar style, who trains nonstop with Merab. And I love that storyline too. Merab is coming back to avenge the loss of his best friend in Aljamain Sterling. I think that'd be a very compelling storyline. And I think it's a much more compelling fight in general. I think Sean O'Malley can win that fight. I think he can use his footwork, and I think he can brutally KO Merab Dvalishvili. I also think Merab, if he can survive and absorb damage from O'Malley, he can drown O'Malley with his stamina and his nonstop wrestling. I want to see that matchup. That is the fight to make. That is the true deserving #1 contender. And if it wasn't him, and Corey Sandhagen couldn't fight, because Corey Sandhagen is also more deserving than Marlon Chito Vera, considering he just beat him not that long ago, then okay. Then we can have the conversation. But essentially what the UFC is going to do, I believe they're going to do, is they're going to let Sean O'Malley, and basically they want him to be a future star. They're going to let him kind of pick and choose his future opponents, which just delegitimizes the sport when you're having a guy who's 1-1 in his last 2 fights, fighting for the title. It makes absolutely no sense. Other than you have the storyline there of the backstory of they fought many years ago and O'Malley lost. Now he's the champion. He's going to defend the belt and try to avenge his loss from 2020. But what really upsets me about all this is no one is really willing to criticize this in the capacity it needs to be criticized, because in particular, a lot of MMA media, they're scared of the UFC. If they are credentialed by the UFC, they are worried about criticizing the UFC for fear of backlash. On top of that, they're worried about fan backlash as well. There's going to be people saying, oh no, we need O'Malley versus Chito too. We need Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. They're worried about a little bit of fan backlash, but they're worried about the UFC. But I think the one factor that a lot of people don't take into account, and this just shows the landscape of MMA media in general, it's an absolute disaster. They want whatever the biggest fight possible that will generate interest. They want that fight to happen no matter what the consequences. They don't care if a guy's on a 7-fight losing streak. If he is the biggest draw, if he can generate the most clicks, they want him in a title fight. They cheerlead this type of behavior. They will not criticize this type of behavior because it's job stability for them, and also it indirectly puts money in their pockets. They don't care that Colby Covington's been out for 1.5 years. They don't care that Marlon Vera is 1-1 in his last 2 fights. They look at it and they say, okay, the storyline behind this, I can generate the most clicks on my website. I can generate the most views on my, YouTube videos, YouTube channel. And that's why a lot of people won't say this. A lot of people say, oh, I want Conor McGregor in a title fight. I'm just using him as an example because guess what? He's going to generate the most revenue for you in your job. He's going to generate the most clicks on articles. He's going to generate the most clicks in interviews and other videos covering that topic. So they don't care that it's heading down a slippery slope and essentially turning into a popularity contest. And what I think is so disappointing is this is just becoming more and more commonplace. And eventually 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, it's going to be every title fight. Now we're just going to see, oh, who can become the most popular on social media? Who can become the biggest draw possible in terms of, oh, the fans care about this guy. We can sell pay-per-views with him. So, oh, let's throw him in a title fight. Even though he doesn't deserve it, there's these other deserving contenders. Imagine if the NFL or the NBA was ran like that. Imagine they said, oh, well, we want the most popular teams in the Super Bowl, so we don't care that this team went, 5-11 over the course of the NFL season. We're putting them in the Super Bowl anyway. Think about that. Think about that. And that is the path we are heading down because of horrible MMA media coverage, because of the fans' acceptance of these undeserved title shots. And on top of that, you have everyone in between MMA media to casual MMA media. They're cheerleading this stuff because they're like, oh, this is better for my overall pockets. This indirectly puts money in my pocket because The fan interest is a little bit higher for this, so this is what I'm going to cheerlead. I'm not going to criticize it because I wanted to put money in my pocket, and I just think it's super disappointing, and I'm wondering already in 2024, what are some more undeserving title shots that we're going to get? I hope we don't get much more of them to start off 2024, because essentially the end of 2023 is looking like all undeserved title shots. And I wanted to put out this video as a full criticism of all these undeserved title fights that people are cheerleading. I know this isn't going to be a super popular video. People are going to say, oh, these are the fights I want to see. But at the end of the day, we should stick to at least somewhat of a semblance of a meritocracy in the UFC. And I'm just very disappointed that it isn't. And I'm just worried that it's going to get worse. There's always been undeserved title shots. I just don't want it to continue to go down that slippery slope where at some point, there's no going back. At some point, whoever's the most popular is getting the title fights. And also, if you're a popular champ, you get to dictate all your title defenses, which basically delegitimizes the entire sport. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.